Welcome to the last presentation of this series of the 2021-2022 apparent series of seminars. Today we will hear from Nathanael Snow. Nathanael is a George Mason grad with his PhD in economics. He got it in 2019. He's now at Ball State University. He's assistant teaching professor there, and today he will present his working paper on the political economy of the informal social group. So with that, Nathanael, the screen is yours. Yeah, thank you.
Are we going to record this one?
It's being recorded. Yes,
Great.
I usually just cut off the beginning.
Yeah, good. All right, I'm glad to hear that. Okay, thank you. Well, thanks for having me this time to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the political economy of the informal social group and the origins of legitimacy. So let me give you an example. How many of you play Wordle? Right. What's the first rule of Wordle? That you don't share the answer. Well, what about giving a hint? Is that allowed? Generally frowned upon unless the hint is particularly clever and understood by only a few, like sub-wordling someone. The idea is that the way that we talk is constitutive of the group that we're participating in. So Jim Buchanan emphasizes the rules for making rules. Like Rawls, Buchanan considered a veil of uncertainty behind which people could select the rules for society. Unlike Rawls, Buchanan thought that the outcome of that conversation would not be known. Rawls's description was conjecture. He imposed a particular set of norms. Perhaps we can do better by considering what rules might be for the conversation that takes place behind the veil of ignorance. So a more egalitarian constitutional convention might generate a more egalitarian constitution. But if a few demagogues dominate the conversation, the resultant constitution could be more likely to protect the privileges of some. Luckily, the conversation need not be behind any kind of veil, and it is ongoing. So what we need to do is to understand how to talk. The way that we talk will be at least partially determinative of the kind of world that we wind up living in. Now, among the weaknesses of representative democracy is vulnerability to special interest groups. Concentrated benefits may be gained for a select few through access to political privileges that result in dispersed costs to a set of the population that can't overcome the difficulties of collective action necessary to oppose the special interest group politically. A special interest group might be able to engage in exchanges directly with the individuals who are in power. There must be a person, though, on both sides of an exchange if there's going to be any kind of negotiation. Special interest groups have someone authorized to make decisions on behalf of the group when interacting with people in the political realm. But we observe other groups, decentralized groups with no focal point, no person authorized to make decisions on behalf of the group, no mechanism for generating that authority or selecting that person. On the other hand, there is no Pope of evangelicalism. We observe informal social groups. There is no formal constitution, but American evangelicalism as a peculiar phenomenon does exist. How does it hold together? How does any special interest group or any informal social group hold together? It helps if we start with an expanded, if not imperial, perspective of what the field of political economy is. Economics, I like to say, is the study of human behavior within the context of exchange relationships, much more than the study of the allocation of scarce resources without alternative uses. Participants within informal social groups can foster market exchange, overcoming transactions costs through side payments of approbation. Also, the shared interpretation of language by participants of an informal group renders contracts more complete, thus providing better definitions of property rights. So this all goes back to Adam Smith when he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments. What we learned by going back to the founders is how language and practice, what I wind up calling a repertoire, provides a sort of tacit social contract that holds a group together. though it has no central decision maker. Language is the medium of social exchange, of reconciliation. The Greek word catalactics was used both for exchange and reconciliation, as was identified by Richard Whately, who was once called the Great White Bear, which is why I wear this tie. And it facilitates democracy as defined as governance by the mechanism is the exchange of sympathies communicated through approbation or disapprobation for the performance of a shared repertoire. So here we see a person performing a repertoire for an informally social gathered group. They are judging his performance of the repertoire. If his performance merits it, they will give him the approbation that he desires, and he will be welcomed into the group. That's analogous to the exchange of goods or services in a market. Some behaviors in the market are considered fair, perhaps because the rules of the marketplace of the fair are different from the household. The rules at the fair, if the fair is like a troupe of traveling merchants, will be more impersonal, more non-intuitive than the rules in the village. A behavior that is not fair doesn't pass muster at the fair. It's considered foul, like a foul ball in baseball, in the same way that we think of some language as foul. No one's in charge of the market, but there are rules. Humans have a propensity to truck, barter, and exchange. We're the animal that talks, we try to persuade. Our talk and the way we behave towards one another is how we exchange sympathies. And no one is in charge of the informal group, but there are rules. There's a repertoire, a performance that we produce for one another in order to gain the approbation of others. Patterns of behavior that come to be a part of a repertoire can also be recognized quickly and at low cost by others who have learned that repertoire. There's a broad repertoire that almost everybody knows. And then there are more narrow repertoires that only a few people will be familiar with. So this is a meme from a TV show called Letterkenny that not everybody will get. Most of us know the beginning of Beethoven's Fifth. The repertoire includes all the terms and phrases, the gestures and memes, the patterns that make up that 30% of social activity that Deirdre McCloskey identifies as sweet talk. We sweet talk when we seek another person's approbation. But there are varieties of repertoires, a polycentric overlapping of repertoires. Every affectionate relationship develops patterns of language, peculiar symbols and images and unique practices. Sweetheart and darling have pet names for each other. Fans at a Boston's concert might skank together. A couple strangers see each other in public. One says war, the other says eagle, because they're both wearing Auburn t-shirts. People belong to multiple and overlapping groups, each with different repertoires. What's considered fair in one setting is foul in another. Skanking at an Auburn football game might be met with darling's disapproval. Overlapping affections is not in itself problematic. From within an informal social group, the development of formal organizations is like Coase's framework for firms, like coagulations of butter in a pail of milk. In any performance, different actors play different roles. A social entrepreneur might attempt to steer participants of an informal social association into a formal organization, similar to the formation of a firm. A firm may increase the exchange of sympathy, of party feeling within its social sphere, in which the entrepreneur will receive residuals of approbation from the members. However, a social firm might encourage party spirit, leading to vicious faction, and may foreclose upon sympathetic exchange with those outside the faction. The repertoire is compromised when it is used to capture rents. A factional social firm captures social rents. The decision to formalize to capture rents is made by an entrepreneur who considers the benefit of access to political exchange as worth the cost of the lost sympathy with others outside the group. Selling out to the mainstream will generate harsh disapprobation from those who remain true to the broader cause. So the Coasean puzzle as to when an entrepreneur will decide to internalize a productive process finds an analogy at the point at which the repertoire of an informal social group is internalized by a social entrepreneur. This is because firms face constant tension between seeking profits and seeking rents. between actions that benefit all of society, from which they capture a portion of the surplus, and actions that just benefit themselves, like crony capitalism, at the expense of some other portion of society. Formal associations face similar tensions. Coase's research agenda initiated a project that seeks to identify what factors relate to coordination through egalitarian relations as compared to those that achieve coordination through hierarchical relations. When formal associations engage in political exchanges, there's a mutual exchange of legitimacy between the parties. A formal government agency cannot exchange directly with an informal social group and cannot anticipate direct mutual gains from acknowledging that informal group's presence. The informal social group likewise cannot promise any kind of support or benefit to political agents. Once some portion formalizes sufficient to engage in political exchange with the legitimate institution, the formal group ceases to be averse to that institution and becomes complicit with that institution's claims to legitimacy. At that point, the formal portion of the group becomes essentially a special interest group. Typically, formalization will require some compromise with respect to the repertoire. If an informal social group is highly specialized among its participants in performance of the repertoire, any performance that does not involve all the members will be missing some elements. The agreement required to create a formal social group will typically be different in purpose and in process from the tacit agreement that emerges from the ongoing conversation among participants in an informal social group. And consequently, the resulting communication of the formal group will be different in kind and content. An informal social group may fail if participants defect into other informal or formal existing or new groups, if the repertoire depreciates unexpectedly, or if vicious faction causes it to implode. Whately describes a world that regresses to a stable equilibrium. He says that party spirit, when not duly controlled, will produce bitter animosity, and internal divisions will subdivide and multiply them and will separate into hostile factions the existing factions. The repertoire that allows for party spirit will consume itself, experiencing factions, and then factions of those factions, until no surviving part is attractive to the participants or socially influential enough to justify taking notice of. The vicious factions will die off, and any part of the informal social group that avoided falling into faction will be all that remains. The result is analogous to the market faction, the cartel, that experiences chiseling from within and eventually causes its collapse. So Kaplan says that if you want to combat error, critique your in-group. You speak their language and they trust you, so you might persuade someone. If you want to raise your status, critique your out-group. They won't listen, but your in-group will love it. That's factious behavior. That's party spirit, that latter. An informal social group's repertoire presents an alternative to the dominant political conversation and a challenge to existing formal political institutions. The informal group symmetrically cannot authorize the legitimacy of an existing government. However, it can demonstrate disapprobation towards individuals seeking office. The participants of an informal social group may treat the approbation of their peers as a more imminent and possibly a higher authority than that of a ruler. The repertoire of the informal social group shapes the sort of government that participants consider legitimate. If a ruler has a weak hold on power, or if he must remain sensitive to democratic processes, he may choose to act in conformity with the repertoire. If an informal social group can count as participants a large enough number of people, and if the informal social group can be observed to surround the median voter, then the government may have an incentive to avoid policies that could mobilize the informal social group into activities that generate additional cost for government actions. The way that we talk shapes the rules that we adopt for our society. A liberal conversation increases the probability that a liberal order will emerge. A sustained and uncompromising informal social group challenges the structure and legitimacy of the government to the extent that it refuses to formalize and engage in political exchange. An informal social group may pose a greater threat to incumbents than an organized protest with a formal organization behind it, such as a social movement organization, because there's no direct exchange of legitimacy with an informal social group. Instead, the informal social group imposes constraints on government. The tension between the mandates and constraints of the repertoire and the mandates and constraints of the formally enforced laws must enter into the calculus of the government's decision makers. So that's the basic presentation that I have for my paper, but I want to also add these elements that are not in the paper that you may have read. First, there are some concerns whether or not there's anything novel in this paper. On the one hand, if there's nothing novel, then no big deal, because iteration helps, right? McCloskey and Why Liberalism Works, it gives a huge list of people who are arguing against liberalism, and they're all basically saying the same thing, but they keep saying it, and we might just need more people saying the right things as well. However, I think that there are some novel elements in this paper. First, I apply this Kosian framework that I think helps us to identify the marginal cases in the distinction between formal and informal groups. And I think that helps to apply this whole framework to more contexts. Secondly, I make heavy use of sympathetic exchange from a Smithian point of view, as understood through Richard Whately's work. And so in part, this paper is kind of a history of thought paper that looks back at Richard Whately. Next, I incorporate this term repertoire. Michaela in Freedom and Contention, Michaela Novak has used this term also, and she cites an older version of this presentation in her book. So I think that I'm onto something, and she says I am too. Then I want to do a couple of contrasts. So Jamie Lemke and Virgil Storr won a prize for the paper Defending the Weak Will of the People, an Economic Perspective on Collective Will in Democratic Societies from APPE this year. And what I noticed in this paper is that they have a similar kind of idea about how exchange happens informally and through language. But in their paper, they're focusing on the entrepreneurship of the repertoire by political actors, which is kind of an exogenous approach. They're exogenously shaping the repertoire, and they're giving a lot of power to the politicians to do that in their model. I think that actually I'm trying to do something that's more endogenous, where the framing of that repertoire occurs endogenously amongst the people, and then actually the politicians have to move around to try to accommodate the repertoire that's existing already, as compared to shaping the repertoire. And then also I want to, let's see here. So I also want to respond to Novak a little bit here. Social movement theory, which is what she's talking about, in general has a progressive bias. It's all about progressive social movements. And if you're not a progressive social movement, then you might not be allowed to be called a social movement by social movement theorists. This tends to neglect groups that establish and sustain the status quo. What I'm trying to show is that the status quo emerges endogenously through groups that are held together by the same interrelational forces that form and sustain change-focused groups. Furthermore, the groups that constitute the status quo are a more prevalent phenomenon. We see that happening more often, given that they demonstrate survival. Finally, groups that form for change might be more prone to faction and vicious faction than groups that persist about the status quo. So this can help us understand why social movements for change so often fail. In short, the social movement literature examines a subcategory of a more broad field of human action, explained well by models of human behavior within exchange relationships, as developed primarily through price theory, but analogously applicable to social contexts that involve exchanges of sympathy, such as approbation and disapprobation. So in particular, what I seek to contribute is an analogy to Coase's definition of the firm. And so I can go on from there, but we can think about the Occupy movement and other movements as examples of this kind of phenomenon, but I think I'll stop there and ask for your comments and questions.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Nathanael. I think there's plenty novel in the paper, but you're right, even if there isn't reiteration always helps. And I think in many ways, we are in the business of reiterating the great ideas, and we need more of that. So thanks for the great presentation, and let's start with some questions. So I'm just gonna, oh, we have already a first hand up. So Jim, please go ahead. And then Iris, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Thank you for sharing. First off, you know, this is always a big challenge trying to articulate the schema, right? And I guess what I'm hearing and what I would recommend is, I think there are ideas where you have terms that I think already have been picked up by maybe other concepts. So, for example, and I see you trying to do it with COS, which obviously big fan of, right? But for example, use this term repertoire. This sounds a lot like ensemble that I've seen in Marx, right? And maybe that's a particular translation of the Marx that I'm reading. But I know this concept already exists. And I feel like you know, there's a handful of concepts that you go through that you can lean a little bit harder on people. You know, I try to do this in my own work, for example, and I'm not recommending that you follow suit in this particular example, but with the idea of community and the conversation about community and order that you see with Buchanan and that you see in the moral order theorists, starting with Gauthier, but moving through a lot of our friends at Arizona, for example. So, right, there's a lot of big concepts we can lean on, conversations that already exist if we want to do this. I see you making that effort, but I want to encourage you to keep making that effort.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, what's challenging here, right, is that there are multiple literatures that have each tried to come at this issue from different angles, and they mostly only talked to one another. So I find myself reading over in sociology a little bit. I find myself going to philosophy talks and religious studies talks where they talk about discourse communities sometimes, and trying to understand it. And this exploration of this paper was an independent exploration, right? So I started digging into this stuff all by myself and trying to understand it. And this is what I came up with. And yeah, now I'm finding, okay, there is all this other stuff out there. And then I'm also, like, as I reread some stuff that we read in grad school, I'm realizing, oh, I'm picking this up from a lot of different places, right? That it's shown up before, but there's still other places that it needs to be dealt with. I think that it's an important time to be doing this because we're in a more contentious environment in terms of discussion and the civic discussion. So I again, iteration isn't a problem to me, as long as somebody will publish it.
Right. Okay, perfect. And Aris?
Okay, well, thank you for your quite interesting and thought-provoking presentation and paper. I have a few comments. One of them is that the general context in which many of us are working, economics as the study of exchange relations, might be a step forward away from economics as allocation, but it doesn't really consider human relations as power relations enough to make a contribution that is going to be heard by other groups and other disciplines that have studied social organization as essentially a reshuffling of power relations. But the informal groups that you're mentioning, the boundaries between informal and formal can be a little bit blurred, particularly because a dynamic view of what social movements, how social movements evolve, and how informal groups rise to have common rules and some leading figures, probably some of them on the way to become formal groups or not, still allows power relation to exist and to emerge within this informal network of relationships, and allow some leaders to negotiate with power, some leading figures, influential figures. For instance, a church organization, you're mentioning the evangelicals. It's not that you don't have a pope, you don't have a central node with formal powers, but you do have some important leaders, some central nodes in the network, more influential nodes that use their leverage to negotiate with political power. And that is why I say this: the study of power relations should not be necessarily neglected. But what you can make out of this is to suggest that this, I think that the informal, the sphere of informal movements, what we call civil society, away from firms and think tanks and formal private organizations or NGOs, perhaps allows much more mobility, which is where we can identify freedom in exit, freedom in having a much more fluid landscape of power relations than the rigid brackets in which society is organized under firms and under church organizations with leaders, and of course under government. So essentially, this is what I'd like to focus on: is that this dichotomy underplays this dynamism that exists and the porous boundaries between power as agency. And the second thing is also to move a step further, power in the structure as well, that even in the repertoires, you will see that there is a huge literature in linguistics that suggests that even without an agent pushing an agenda or imposing a narrative, you still have embedded power even in the emergent repertoires, that language itself embodies power relations and reproduces asymmetries. So power is ubiquitous, and I'm afraid that there's kind of a direction that we have taken in a kind of a broader network that wants to take economics and the study of society away from allocation to exchange relations, might underplay the presence of power.
Yeah, that's really important. And I think, that's a big part of what Wagner is trying to do when he makes this entangled move, right? And he brings in Schmidt and other people that are interested in power relations, right? So one way of trying to think about this is to say that the liberal move is to try to identify what kinds of collective action decisions can be made through exchanges as compared to through power moves, and to think about those carefully, and to try to maximize those, and to try to limit as much as possible those kinds of collective decisions or collective actions that require power. And I think that that's just a big part of that whole project. And so I think the boundaries are somewhat blurred, but what I'm trying to identify is what would the marginal case be, right? And to what I'm trying to understand and push back on this, please, but is that when there is a central decision maker that has the capacity to exchange, and then maybe, okay, I need to include there that also has the capacity to exert power. Maybe that's the point that I'm missing the most, is that I also need to include when somebody has the ability to exert power in a broader explanation of all these kinds of social interactions. When there is not somebody who is authorized or who has the legitimacy to make the decision on behalf of the entire group, yeah, they can make that exchange on behalf of some smaller portion of that group, like a leader of a religious denomination or of a group like the moral majority. Then that person is engaging in an exchange. And so that's the thing that I think I'm contributing the most here, is that identifying that in order for an exchange to obtain, there has to be a person involved. Does there have to be a person involved when we're talking about power? I'm not sure. I would want to think more about that. And I like what you say about the linguistics, how linguistics also embed power and hierarchy. Another paper that I have called How to Talk is about how to eliminate exertions of power from the way that we talk, so that we can achieve a more liberal conversation. And I have in mind an idea that when suppose that there are unequal distributions of resources within an economy initially, but then then open market processes are established. We should expect that over the long run, those unequal distributions of resources will shift towards what is most efficient, and it won't be unequal anymore. The inequalities of the initial allocations will be eroded gradually over time through the market process. I have in mind the similar idea that in power relations that are focused on language, that if we adopt a more liberal way of talking, the power relations, or the ability to exert power will eventually be eroded. And I think that that's kind of what Whately was trying to get at in terms of the chiseling effect that happens to social groups, to factions over time. That faction breeds faction over time. So that's the way that I would want to think about that in terms of familiarity with linguistics. Haven't gotten there. It's on the pile. I've got Searle right over there, waiting for and Nussbaum and some others for me to get to as soon as I can. So I don't know how you would push back on any of that, or what directions you would consider to be the most fruitful, or whether any of that needs to be incorporated in this paper before it can go out and into the world.
Yeah, well, not just about this paper. I like the fact that when the last part, what you're saying about liberalism and language, you're introducing dynamism in something that linguists studied as, that power always exists, but power is kind of power through language is reshuffled in a society of more freedom of exchange. And we know that in some cases, relationships, the way we call people becomes more informal. There is change based on how the structure of economic and political relationships are shaped. So I like this dynamism. I would like to see the same dynamism in the categories that you have created that essentially separate formal from informal groups. This is something that is missing. And what is generally, I think, a good addition to entangled political economy is, yes, we emphasize emergent properties out of exchange relationships, but these emergent properties might still acquire the patterns of power asymmetries. So even after exchanges, if they're after a step of voluntary associations, creating something that becomes embedded in rules, that creates some formal and informal relationships later on, repertoires, and leading figures as well, because the coordination requires some central nodes in the communication. This structure, again, even if it's the product of exchange, will become steeped or driven by proto-power relationships that might lead us later on to more rigid forms. And this goes back even with the study of the tribal societies and how small villages coming together, essentially building kingdoms and creating dynasties. So this is kind of the dynamism that I want to bring generally in the entangled political economy framework, of understanding that we're not done by saying exchanges, voluntary, informal relationships. They're not totally horizontal. If we are going to introduce emergence, we have to understand how power emerges out of those relationships, and much more when it comes to more permanently as links for informal groups, as opposed to transactions that we may have with a butcher or with people that we don't know and we may never meet again. So that's, yes, in the market, it's more difficult to see the construction of this, of power structures through impersonal bridging relationships. But with informal groups, you had this tendency of formalization of power coming back, with leaders appearing before Black Lives Matter, or before that in Paris in 1968, or in different social movements. You've seen the creation of power structures out of that.
Yeah, that's right. What maybe I can get at is when those power structures are considered legitimate as compared to not being considered legitimate. And if a power node, for lack of a better term, so far has legitimacy, then I might try to claim that it still is the product of a tacit exchange, that we have granted approbation and legitimacy to you to make these decisions, to have the power to make those decisions, provided that the decisions that you make remain within the repertoire of the group. So that's my first take on that, my initial take on that, but it's definitely something I want to think about a lot more.
Okay, so let's move on to Michelle.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation and the paper. What drew me in was the focus on the sympathetic persuasion of Smith. And so if you are looking for potential publication or other outlets, I suggest the International Adam Smith Society. They run a nice conference and they publish a journal. So they might be interested, especially bringing in the Smith and Whatley together. I always like to have examples of the theory, and you kind of hinted around the example of the evangelicals. In fact, most of that was in your conclusion. Can you briefly walk me through the theory within the context of that specific example? Or if you don't want to take the time now, perhaps that is something that could be added to the paper, a more systematic analysis of a particular example.
So I'll give you the brief version with American evangelicals, and this whole paper and this research agenda was born out of earlier attempts to explain American evangelicalism using more basic or familiar public choice voting models. But in each of those iterations of this project, I treated the evangelical movement and the participants within that movement as special interest groups that were cycling basically for control over this larger special interest group, and working through it over and over and over again. And I was trying to use like a Charlie Plott style model, and I mentioned this stuff to Plott back at a conference several years ago, and he was just saying, that doesn't work, and he was right. That using those traditional voting models didn't work. And so what I did was I said, well, maybe this is a social movement instead. So I went and read a bunch of sociology on social movements, which gave me sort of the framework to contrast what I wound up with against that literature. Although I think Michaela does a good job of synthesizing that literature with where this larger project is going. But evangelicalism is not it is a dynamic phenomenon. It's not a static phenomenon. So sometimes evangelicals in their public rhetoric will include Mormons and Catholics in their activities. And what I notice about that is that, traditionally those groups would not have been invited into the informal group at all. But in order to try to maintain a surrounding of the median voter, fringe groups close to evangelicalism might receive approbation from the informal social group so as to maintain or to more securely capture the median voter within the boundaries there. And so that whether it's a big tent or a small tent, kind of an informal group, might be dependent upon, well, the location of the median voter, and then the variance about our estimation of the location of the median voter. Do we know really well where the median voter is? And if not, then we might broaden the tent, right? And we might allow more riffing on the repertoire, or more elements that are somewhat outside of the repertoire and familiar, but not really part of the core repertoire. So the repertoire expands and collapses without anybody intentionally doing it, right? There's nobody in charge of that, but this happens, emergently, right? And because there's nobody in charge. So that's my first example of it. Another example would be like the Occupy movement, which I briefly mentioned.
Yeah.
One thing that the Occupy movement did was they did not appoint somebody who was in charge of the Occupy movement. And they did that intentionally because they had no intention of compromising. They realized that if somebody were appointed the leader of the group, then they would have authority to bargain and to make compromises of their demands. And instead, they decided, no, we're not going to have anybody in charge. And we're not even going to have a very explicit set of demands that can be bargained among. Right. They instead said that, these are the things that we think are bad and what we want to see changed. And we're not going to negotiate on it. Now, maybe that led to the failure of the Occupy movement, right? Because they weren't actually able to enter into those kinds of exchanges. But maybe in the long run, they've actually achieved more of their goals through this informal process by placing constraints on the actions and decisions of politicians than they might have been able to obtain had they entered into bargaining or selling out, as they would call it, right? So those are the kinds of examples that I would think of.
All right.
Thanks, that's very helpful.
Perfect. One example, which I don't know if it's helpful or not, but and probably not for this paper, but subsequent projects is the labor unions with Amazon. Like that seems to be quite interesting and very, very timely. But what you just said about the Occupy movement and not having specific goals and sort of have they been successful or not, I don't know if we have an answer to it, right? I don't know. I don't think it's a very yes or no question. And I think I have trouble formalizing my thoughts with this, but so be patient, I guess. I think this really speaks to this idea of credence goods and power. So you sort of like when we talk about power, right? Sort of the production or what the social it's. The social groups, right, or the special interests are formed around certain goals, but those goals are if you look at them, they're very hard to measure, right, and to know if they were achieved. Right? I don't know what the pronounced mission for BLM is, but I would say it's probably something with ending racial inequity. Well, how do you measure that, right? Like you can always have rhetoric that points to some examples of racial inequity. So I think that's going to be at least in Wagner, that's an important element of building this power. That whatever the outcomes you're promising, they're not easily measurable. So the reason people even belong and participate is that tied in approbation, right? Like why do people support the forming of the labor unions? Because their friends support, right? Like you want to be in this particular group or you want to be in this other particular group to have Thanksgiving conversations about it and so on and so forth, right? So there needs to be, like if you're building a movement, you need to create that community because that's sort of the actual thing that people seem to benefit from. But your actual goals, not your actual goals, the power, right? And the goals you're pursuing, I don't think are as measurable. Anyway, I don't think I'm being super clear, but I think the credence goods probably belong into the story. So yeah.
What would the primary source be for, or the text on credence good be?
Oh, okay. Probably the peculiar. So I would say two things: the peculiar goods, the book, right? The politics as a peculiar business. But there's also a paper that I love, and I can send you a copy of that. It's from like 76 on public advertising. And it's very hard to, like, I had to have our library get that paper for me, but it's, I think, first place where he formulates this idea of credence goods, and it's done with like neoclassical sort of, not language, but like it touches on to the standard theory. So for me, that was a very useful text. Anyway, yeah, so those are the two.
That's good. I think that what you're talking about, like what's the measurable for Black Lives Matter when they've accomplished their goals, or when the power structures that exist have satisfied their demands, right? I think that Black Lives Matter would say that our demands have been met when we say they've been met.
Yeah.
right? And when and they don't want it to be measurable, right? And that's
Right.
exactly this kind of permitting or giving of legitimacy or withholding of legitimacy, right? If we say that something is legitimate, then it's okay. But if we withhold legitimacy, we're not there yet. The repertoire won't grant you legitimacy because you haven't gotten there yet. It's interesting. A question that I started to ask some folks around here is calling the police an act of violence? And the answer is, it depends who you are. Right? Well, if that's the answer, then the police don't really have full legitimacy.
Right.
The police are legitimate amongst some, but not amongst everyone, right?
Right.
And there are specific cases where that kind of problem has come up, where somebody has called the police, perceiving it as police as a mechanism of arbitration, whereas the other party in that situation perceived it as an act of violence. So is the formal institution considered legitimate or not? That's sort of another thing that I'm trying to get at here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think Jim, right? You have a question? Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So interesting. Your discussion there, and I heard the word identity thrown around, and I think this is actually really critical concept for these discussions about sort of in-group versus out-group. What's the difference between an in-group in terms of shared identity versus the coalition that you're mentioning? Say we have evangelicals and there's subgroups within that, and then there's, you know, what you are calling from within that perspective more fringe, but included in the coalition of interests, right? It's so I think a lot of the conversation gets helped in terms of talking about legitimacy if we can identify where that identity is sourced from, and that everybody agrees that they share that identity, and therefore they're expected to hold some mix of beliefs, right, which include norms of behavior. I think there's a lot there for you to leverage in your approach. I mentioned you in a comment just to you a few minutes ago in terms of legitimacy and bargaining. That Buchanan gives us some very good ideas about that. And in particular, if we can think of these identity groups, one, figure out where the identity is coming from, and two, imagine them bargaining as groups over what society should look like. I think now we're moved in a direction that looks, you know, broadly applicable, that fits pretty well with the conversations that we're seeing right now. I think it opens some questions about what identity actually is. We're used to thinking about identity racially, in terms of gender. What does identity look like in terms of community, right? And then how does that fit within this broader context? How does that inform what we're talking about? A lot of really interesting questions here.
So I haven't read Between Anarchy and Leviathan, so I'll hop onto that. It's on the shelf over here, I'm sure. So yeah, I guess what I was really after was how does identity form, right? And how do these informal groups figure out who they are and what kind of a group forms? And so I look at the Smithian sympathetic exchange as the mechanism that forms that identity, and that the repertoire is the tacit social contract that monitors and disciplines that behavior, and in-group or out-groupness. The out-group kind of thing, when faction becomes vicious, is oftentimes when means get confused for ends. So Whately is writing to a religious context and the religious controversies in the early 1800s, and he calls it idolatry. He says that when, like, a flag that is supposed to be used to help people identify who's part of the group and to rally people together becomes in and of itself the end that people are focused on, right? Then you've really fallen into party spirit as compared to party feeling. And that's when you have a vicious faction. And maybe that is a signal of the emergence of power. When it becomes something that there's extractive rents on the repertoire occurring, that then generates, those rents are the source of the power within those contexts. So if I can expropriate on the repertoire and capture rents from that relationship, then I have leverage over the others in my interactions. And then I can use that to exert power. So it might even be a way of explaining the emergence of those kinds of power relations. Although maybe I'm trying to be too all encompassing here, right? And doing too much, but I think that I'm getting at a lot of these different things. And most of this stuff is in the paper in some way. But yeah, I'll definitely take a look at the Buchanan.
All righty, excellent. Well, looks like we are done with the questions. Nathaniel, do you have any final thoughts you would like to share with us?
No, thank you so much for engaging. If you want to get in touch with me, it's ndsnow@gmail or ndsnow@bsu.edu. I covet your thoughts. If you've got any other comments that you didn't get to, please share them with me.
Sure.
And again, this has really been a great opportunity to get deep feedback on what I've done here. I presented a few times now, and I'm looking to send this off to someone as soon as possible. So Michelle, thanks for that suggestion. Are you running that now, or is it Chris Martin in charge over there? Do you know?
I would check with Chris.
Okay. I tried to get in touch with Chris the other day and it didn't work, so I'll try again.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for the presentation, and thank you all for coming on the call. This was our last workshop, but we do have some things in the works for the summer, so I'll be in touch, probably over email, about those. But yeah, thank you for today, and thank you for the whole year, and for joining us. It's always a great experience. So thank you. Yep.
Thanks, Marta.
Bye. Take care.
Bye.